Welcome back to the Deep Dives. We're the place you come to get smart about big ideas fast. We dig into the sources, pull out the core insights, and hopefully help you challenge some assumptions, maybe find those aha moments.
And today, we are diving deep into a book that definitely stirred the pot in the business world. It's 0 to 1, Notes on Startups, or How to Build the Future by Peter Thiel.
Yeah, Thiel, co-founder of PayPal, Palantir, early investor in Facebook, SpaceX. I mean, the guy's got credentials. But this book, it's not just another how-to guide for startups, is it?
Not at all. It's really, well, it's almost a philosophical treatise wrapped in business advice. Thiel offers this unvarnished, often really provocative perspective. He's not trying to win popularity contests here.
Definitely not. So let's get straight to it. What if the fundamental ways you think about business, about competition, planning, even luck, what if they're just wrong? Thiel basically argues competition is for losers. That's a direct quote. And he says real progress, the kind that actually changes things, comes from thinking 0 to 1, not just 1 to n.
It's a total inversion of what, most business schools teach, what most economics classes preach. It forces you to question some really foundational stuff about innovation.
Okay, so let's start with that hook. Forget Econ 101. Forget that idea that perfect competition is the ideal state.
Right. Forget the endless grind of trying to beat your rivals, thinking that rivalry itself is inherently productive.
Because Thiel, pretty much right out of the gate in 0 to 1, just drops this bomb. He says, and I'm quoting again, all happy companies are different. Each one earns a monopoly by solving a unique problem. All failed companies are the same. They fail to escape competition.
It's designed to make you stop and think, isn't it? I mean, this book sold millions, but that core idea that monopolies are not just okay, but essential for real progress, that's completely counterintuitive for most people.
Yeah, we're taught monopolies are bad. They stifle things, they exploit people, right?
Exactly. We see them as the enemy of the consumer, the enemy of innovation in the long run. But Thiel flips that. He argues that perfect competition, the supposed ideal, actually drives profits down towards 0.
Okay.
And when profits are 0 or near 0, companies are just locked in this brutal fight for survival. There's no cash, no breathing room, no incentive to invest in the big, risky, long-term projects that actually lead to breakthroughs.
So competition, in his view, becomes this race to the bottom. Everyone just copies each other, cuts costs, and eventually nobody's making anything truly new or valuable.
That's the gist of it. It's a destructive cycle, not a creative one. He believes it traps businesses in this zero-sum game, fighting over existing scraps instead of encouraging them to create entirely new pies.
Right. So we need to explore why he thinks this isn't just him being edgy, but like a fundamental framework for understanding success, and why it's so damn hard for most of us to even wrap our heads around it.
Yeah, it requires a real mental shift.
So to really get why Thiel lands on these, frankly, radical conclusions, we have to understand his starting point. This distinction he makes between two fundamental types of progress. He calls them 0 to 1 and 1 to n. Can you unpack that for us?
Sure. Let's start with 1 to n. That's the easier one to grasp. Thiel calls it horizontal or extensive progress. Basically, it means copying things that already work, taking existing ideas or technologies and just spreading them around.
Like making more of something we already have.
Exactly. His example is if you have one typewriter and you figure out how to make 100 typewriters, that's 1 to n, you're replicating an existing solution. He often links this directly to globalization.
Globalization is replication. How so?
Well, taking something that works in one place could be a technology, a business model, whatever, and making it work everywhere else. Think of China's development over the last few decades. He argues it's largely been about catching up, straightforwardly copying and implementing technologies and infrastructure that were developed elsewhere.
Like railroads, air conditioning.
Yeah.
Stuff the West already figured out.
Right. Maybe they leapfrog a bit, go straight to mobile phones instead of landlines, but the underlying principle is still taking something proven and scaling it horizontally. It's expansion, diffusion.
Okay, so that's 1 to n. Replication, optimization, scaling existing things. Makes sense. But 0 to 1 is the really different one.
Totally different. 0 to 1 is what he calls vertical or intensive progress. This is about doing entirely new things, creating something literally from nothing, something that didn't exist before.
So not making 100 more typewriters.
Right. It's the leap from the typewriter to the word processor. That's 0 to 1. It's invention. And Thiel uses the word technology for this, but he defines it really broadly.
They're just computers and software.
No, for him, any new and better way of doing things is technology. It could be a new business process, a new energy source, a new medical cure. It's about genuine creation, not just incremental improvement or copying.
And this distinction is absolutely central to his whole argument, right? Because he claims that all the real progress, the stuff that actually creates new wealth and moves society forward, comes from 0 to 1.
Precisely. He argues that just spreading the old ways, the one-to-end stuff globally, without inventing fundamentally new technologies, isn't just insufficient, it's actually unsustainable in the long run.
It's sustainable.
He gives this pretty stark example. Imagine if every household in India suddenly started living exactly like Americans do today, using the current technologies for energy, transport, consumption.
Oh.
The environmental impact, he argues, would be catastrophic. The planet's resources simply couldn't handle that level of consumption using today's tools. So simply globalizing the current way of life without radical new 0 to 1 technologies leads to resource depletion and environmental disaster, not universal prosperity.
Wow. So new tech isn't just nice to have, it's essential to avoid a global crisis as the world develops.
That's his point. We need those vertical leaps, those 0 to 1 breakthroughs to expand abundance and find new, sustainable ways of doing things. Otherwise, globalization just becomes a fight over scarce resources.
And he pins his hopes for this 0 to 1 progress squarely on startups. Why them specifically? Why not big corporations or governments or just lone geniuses?
It's a great question. Thiel's take is that big organizations, the established players, are usually just too slow. They're too bureaucratic. They're often invested in the status quo. They shy away from the kind of massive risks involved in a true 0 to 1 creation.
They're built for 1 to N, for optimizing what they already do.
Exactly. And while brilliant individuals might have the breakthrough ideas, they typically can't build a whole new industry by themselves. That takes a team, a shared vision, focused execution.
So startups hit the sweet spot.
In his view, yes. Small groups bound together by a shared mission, often a really ambitious, maybe even crazy-sounding mission, have the agility, the intense focus, and crucially, the space for new thinking. They can question received ideas from the ground up without all the baggage of an existing institution.
They're the engines of vertical progress.
That's how he sees it, the places where you can actually try to build the future, not just rearrange the present.
Okay, building on that idea of new thinking and questioning assumptions, Thiel is famous for this standard interview question he asks. What important truth do very few people agree with you on?
Ah, yes, the contrarian question. It sounds simple, right? Like a typical tell me about yourself kind of opener.
Yeah, but he argues it's actually incredibly hard to answer. Well, why?
Well, it's difficult on a couple of levels. Intellectually, it's tough because almost everything we learn, everything we're taught in school or read in the news is, by definition, stuff that's generally agreed upon. We're trained to internalize consensus knowledge.
We learn the accepted facts.
Right. And then psychologically, it's maybe even harder. Because answering honestly requires you to state something you know is unpopular, something that goes against the conventional wisdom. You risk looking foolish or arrogant or just plain wrong.
It takes guts.
It takes real intellectual courage, which Thiel thinks is maybe even rarer than raw intelligence. It's basically a test for whether you can actually think for yourself independently.
And he has strong feelings about bad answers, right? Like saying our education system is broken doesn't cut it.
No, because tons of people agree with that. Or saying America is exceptional. Again, widely held belief, or at least common debate point. Even taking a side in a familiar debate like there is no God isn't what he's looking for.
So what makes a good answer in his book?
A good answer has to be genuinely contrarian, but also true. It usually takes the form. Most people believe X is true, but the reality is the opposite of X. It should ideally reveal some kind of hidden insight, something non-obvious.
Something that makes you go, huh, I never thought of it that way.
Exactly. And Thiel actually offers his own answer to this question within the book, and it basically sums up the core thesis of 0 to 1.
Okay, what is it?
He says, most people think the future of the world will be defined by globalization, but the truth is that technology matters more.
Ah, back to the 0 to 1 versus 1 to N.
Precisely. It directly challenges that prevailing assumption that the developed world has sort of reached its peak, technologically speaking, and the future is just about poorer countries catching up by copying what already exists.
The 1 to N future.
Right. He calls this idea the technological end of history. The notion that we've figured out most of the big stuff and now it's just about implementation and distribution. But as we just discussed, he sees that path globalization without new technology as unsustainable. It leads to resource wars, not widespread wealth.
So his contrarian truth is that we haven't figured it all out. We desperately need more 0-to-1 invention.
Yes. We can't just copy our way to a better future. We have to invent it.
That's a powerful framing. And speaking of learning from the past, or maybe mislearning from the past, Thiel spends a lot of time dissecting the dot-com crash of the late 90s. He paints this picture of, well, absolute insanity.
Oh, yeah. He describes it as a time when no loss was too big to be described as an investment in an even bigger, brighter future, which led to these completely absurd anti-business models where companies were literally losing more money the faster they grew.
How does that even work?
Well, take PayPal's own early days, which he recounts vividly. They were paying people $10 to sign up, and another $10 for every friend they referred.
They were paying for users.
Aggressively.
Yeah.
So naturally, they got exponential growth in users, but also
An exponentially growing hole in their bank account.
exactly an exponentially growing cost structure.
Yeah.
But somehow, in the context of the bubble, this was seen as like a brilliant strategy. The logic was get enough users, reach critical mass, then figure out how to make money by charging tiny fees on transactions. It was a mad dash for eyeballs and market share.
Before the money ran out.
Right. They famously raised a huge round, $100 million, in March 2000, literally weeks before the whole thing imploded. It was this chaotic scramble fueled by cheap money and just boundless, maybe baseless optimism.
And Thiel argues that the crash, this divine judgment, as he calls it, didn't actually lead to wisdom. Instead, it led to these 4 deeply ingrained dogmas in the startup world that he thinks are totally wrong and harmful.
Yeah, he sees the reaction as an overcorrection, leading to a set of principles that actually stifle the very innovation that's needed.
Okay, let's break those down. Dogma number 1, make incremental advances. The idea being that the bubble was caused by crazy grand visions, so startups should be humble, take small, safe steps.
Right. Big ideas became suspect. But Thiel's counter is forceful. It is better to risk boldness than triviality.
Why is incrementalism so bad in his view?
Because if you're only making tiny improvements on something that already exists, you're automatically playing in a crowded, competitive field. Your small tweak isn't going to be enough to really stand out or build a defensible business. It doesn't solve a unique problem.
You're stuck in one-to-end territory.
Exactly. He believes only bold, maybe even seemingly crazy ideas have the potential to create something fundamentally new, that 0-to-1 leap, and actually escape the competitive crush. Incrementalism for him is just a slow path to irrelevance.
Okay, dogma number 2 that came out of the crash, stay lean and flexible, which Thiel says basically became code for don't have a plan.
Yeah, the thinking was that planning is arrogant in a fast-changing world. You should just experiment, iterate, pivot, be agnostic about the outcome. But Thiel throws a wrench in that with his counter-dogma. A bad plan is better than no plan.
That sounds deliberately provocative, especially against the backdrop of the whole lean startup movement.
It is. He's not saying iteration isn't important. But he argues that without a definite, bold vision for the future, even if that plan needs tweaking along the way, you're just sort of wandering. You're reacting, making small adjustments to what's already there.
You might find a slightly better version of the current thing, but not the next big thing.
Right. You might optimize locally, but you'll never find that global breakthrough, that 0-to-1 leap. A plan, even a flawed one, gives you direction, a purpose. It allows you to aim for something specific and ambitious, not just drift with the current.
Got it. Dogma number 3, improve on the competition. Don't try to create whole new markets, just find an existing product and make it a bit better, grab some market share.
And Thiel's response to this is probably his most famous line, competitive markets destroy profits.
Back to the monopoly argument.
Absolutely central. If your whole strategy is just to be slightly better than the existing players, you are, by definition, choosing to enter a competitive battle. And what happens in competitive markets, according to economic theory and, Thiel argues, harsh reality?
Profits get squeezed, driven down towards zero.
Exactly. Companies end up cutting corners, competing on price, differentiating in trivial ways. It becomes a commodity business. The only way to build real, lasting value, he insists, is to create something so unique, so much better, he throws out the number 10 times better, than any substitute that you effectively carve out your own space. A temporary monopoly?
That 10x improvement gives you breathing room, margins, the ability to invest.
Right. It lets you escape the zero-sum game.
Okay, and the final dogma. Focus on product, not sales. The idea that if your product is good enough, it should sell itself. Viral growth is the only sustainable growth. Advertising is a sign of weakness.
This came out of seeing all the ridiculous spending during the bubble Super Bowl ads for companies with no revenue. But Thiel thinks this view, often held by engineers, totally misunderstands sales. His counter is blunt. Sales matters just as much as product.
Why is sales so critical, even for a revolutionary product?
Because even the best product doesn't sell itself. You need a way to get it to people, to convince them it's valuable. Distribution matters. He argues that if you invent something amazing but don't invent an effective way to sell it, you might have a great invention, but you have a bad business.
Sales isn't just an add-on, it's core.
It's essential. And often, he says, the best sales is hidden. It's not about loud advertising. It's about understanding distribution channels, partnerships, subtle persuasion. It's a sophisticated skill, just as important as engineering.
So pulling it all together, Thiel's take on the dot-com crash is pretty nuanced. He thinks the peak in March 2000 was insane, yes, but also a moment of clarity because people finally realized we needed valuable new technology.
Right. The desire was there, even if the execution was flawed. And his conclusion is that to build the next generation of great companies, we have to consciously reject these dogmas that arose from the crash. We have to, as he says, think for yourself.
Which, ironically, might be the hardest dogma to break.
Absolutely. It's a call to arms for genuine, independent thinking.
Okay, let's shift gears now into our Antivision segment. This is where we really kick the tires, play devil's advocate, and look for the potential downsides or contradictions in the argument. Thiel makes this incredibly compelling case for creative monopolies. He says they give customers more choices by adding entirely new categories of abundance.
Yeah, he paints them almost as benevolent forces. He argues that unlike companies trapped in fierce competition, monopolies have the resources and the breathing room to actually think about things beyond the bottom line, like ethics. He even cites Google's old "don't be evil" motto as an example, suggesting only a monopolist could afford such a principle.
And they can invest in long-term R&D, the really ambitious stuff, because they're not just fighting for survival quarter to quarter.
Exactly. It's a powerful reframing. Monopolies aren't the problem. Cutthroat competition is. But
let's flip that message. What are the real risks here? He says profits only hurt customers in a world where nothing changes. If the monopoly is creating new stuff, it's okay. Does that really hold up?
well, it arguably downplays the potential for even initially creative monopolies to stagnate. What happens after the initial breakthrough? Once they're dominant, do they keep innovating at the same pace? Or do they become complacent? Do they use their power to crush potential smaller innovators or exploit their customers because, well, where else are they going to go?
Yeah, history is kind of littered with examples of dominant companies becoming bullies or just lazy. Antitrust laws exist for a reason, right? They're not always just targeting illegal bullies. Often they're trying to curb behavior from companies that got dominant, maybe even legitimately at first, but then started acting in anti-competitive ways.
Precisely. The track record of monopolies staying purely benevolent and innovative forever is, let's say, mixed. Power does tend to corrupt, or at least breed complacency, without strong checks and balances or the threat of disruption. Thiel's view seems very optimistic about the long-term behavior of monopolists.
And thinking about who this advice might actually harm, Thiel's very clear. Competitive markets destroy profits. Failed companies fail to escape competition. That message could be really discouraging, maybe even damaging, for tons of entrepreneurs who aren't aiming for global monopoly.
Yeah, think about that local restaurant owner you mentioned earlier, someone focusing on quality, community, creating a great local experience. They might be in a competitive market, but they could be incredibly successful and valuable in their own right. Their goal isn't necessarily to eliminate all other restaurants.
Right. They thrive on having a vibrant local scene, maybe. Healthy competition can push everyone to be better.
Exactly. Thiel's framework, if you take it too literally, could promote this kind of winner-take-all thinking that dismisses the value of that kind of healthy rivalry, or the success of businesses that find a niche within a competitive landscape. It might lead founders to obsess over finding some magical secret to monopoly status and neglect the basics of running a good, sustainable business in the meantime.
You could end up failing because you were only looking for the monopoly, instead of building a solid, albeit competitive, business.
Potentially, yeah. It sets an incredibly high bar, create a monopoly, or you've essentially failed, which might not be realistic or even desirable for every type of venture.
Hmm.
The business world is, thankfully, more diverse than just monopolies and failures.
Okay, another major theme. Thiel champions this idea of having a definite view of the future. You should have a clear plan, a specific vision, and work deliberately to make it happen. He contrasts this with just keeping your options open or having a vague sense of optimism.
He's really critical of what he calls indefinite optimism. He sees it everywhere in modern society. In finance, it's diversification, spreading bets, because you don't actually know where value will be created, so you just hope the overall market goes up.
Passive investing index funds.
Sort of the financial equivalent of shrugging your shoulders about the future. In politics, he sees it in leaders driven by polls and focus groups, managing public perception and shuffling money around with transfer payments, rather than proposing bold, concrete plans to solve specific problems.
And in science.
He critiques approaches like high-throughput screening and drug discovery, just randomly testing millions of molecules hoping for a hit, instead of starting with a definite theory about the biology you're trying to influence. It's the sense that progress is expected, but nobody has a specific blueprint for how it will happen.
It's a powerful critique of societal drift, this idea that we're just waiting for good things to happen instead of architecting them.
Very much so. It's a call for agency and intentionality.
But let's poke at this definite plan idea. He says a bad plan is better than no plan. Isn't that always true? What about situations where the future is genuinely uncertain, information is scarce, or the landscape is changing incredibly fast? Couldn't a rigid, definite plan become a massive blind spot?
That's the tension, absolutely. An overly definite plan could certainly lock you into a course of action that becomes obsolete or misguided as new information emerges. You could march confidently off a cliff.
Right. And Thiel is quite critical of the lean startup idea of just iterating without a bold plan. But isn't that kind of adaptability, that responsiveness to feedback and changing conditions, absolutely vital for survival, especially for a startup trying something truly new?
It is. You need both, arguably. You need a strong vision, a definite direction, but you also need the flexibility to adapt the path to that vision based on reality. Thiel celebrates Steve Jobs for his meticulous planning at Apple, but Apple certainly pivoted and adapted over the years, even if driven by that core Jobsian vision. It's finding that balance between conviction and adaptability that's so hard. Maybe Thiel emphasizes the plan part more because he feels the pendulum swung too far towards aimless iteration post.com.
And what about rejecting diversification for individuals?
Yeah.
Life is not a portfolio, he says. Focus intensely on one thing you're great at. Don't hedge your bets with a diverse resume.
Again, compelling advice for a certain kind of person in a certain situation. Maybe someone with a clear, world-changing talent or idea. But for many people, is that practical? Or even wise?
Yeah, especially if you don't have the safety net or the resources to go all in on one high-risk, high-reward bet. For a lot of us, diversification in skills, experiences, maybe even income streams isn't indefinite pessimism. It's just prudent risk management in an unpredictable world.
It could disproportionately disadvantage people who can't afford to fail spectacularly on their one big bet. Focusing relentlessly on one skill might be great if that skill stays valuable, but what if it doesn't? What if it's not a 0-to-1 skill? Keeping some options open might be the rational choice for navigating career uncertainty.
It feels like advice that works brilliantly if you happen to be Peter Thiel. Maybe less so for everyone else.
It's definitely advice tailored to finding and funding the extreme outliers, the potential world changers.
All right, let's transition to our empathy dive. We try to imagine how the ideas in a book like 0-to-1 might land with someone specific, someone maybe outside that typical tech founder bubble.
Yeah.
Let's think about a creative freelancer, a graphic designer, a writer, maybe a musician, someone who often juggles diverse projects, values collaboration, maybe defines success differently.
Okay, yeah. For a creative freelancer, some of Thiel's concepts could actually be quite energizing, I think. Take the idea of finding secrets.
Secrets for a freelancer.
Yeah, secrets about people. Like, what do their clients really need deep down, even if they can't articulate it? What assumptions or taboos exist in their specific creative industry that could be challenged? Thinking like that could help them find a really unique niche or offer something truly different.
And the idea of building a brand based on proprietary technology, maybe that translates to their unique artistic style, their specific design process, their way of collaborating, something that makes them distinct, not just another interchangeable creative.
Exactly. It gives them a framework for thinking about differentiation beyond just undercutting competitors on price. And Thiel's mantra, "You are not a lottery ticket," could be incredibly empowering.
Oh, so?
It pushes against that common freelancer anxiety of just waiting for the phone to ring, hoping for a lucky break or the next gig to land in their lap. It says, no, you have agency. You can actively shape your career, design your path, build your reputation intentionally. You're the architect, not just waiting for fate.
That could be really motivating, especially in fields that can feel precarious.
Definitely. And even the PayPal Mafia idea, building this tight-knit group of collaborators who genuinely trust and support each other that could resonate. Freelancing can be isolating. Fostering a real community, a mafia of fellow creatives you work well with, could be huge for long-term success and sanity.
Okay, so there's definite inspiration there.
Right.
But I can also see how the relentless focus on achieving monopoly could be really misleading, maybe even harmful for a creative.
How do you mean?
Well, for many artists or designers, success isn't about becoming the only option, eliminating all competition. It's often about finding their unique voice, building a strong reputation within a community, maybe collaborating with other creatives, not crushing them. The goal might be a sustainable practice, not market domination.
That's a great point. The creative ecosystem often thrives on diversity, influence, collaboration. Trying to apply a monopoly or failure mindset could feel alien, or worse, lead to burnout. Imagine the pressure of constantly trying to make your work 10 times better than any possible alternative in a field where taste is subjective.
Yeah, how do you even measure 10x better in art or writing? It could lead to this constant feeling of inadequacy, chasing an impossible standard, especially when incremental improvements, building on others' work and collaboration are often the norm.
And Thiel's dismissal of perks beyond the core mission, the intense, almost cult-like focus he describes at early PayPal, with the expectation of insane hours. That clashes hard with why many people choose freelancing for autonomy, flexibility, work-life balance. Trying to emulate that startup intensity could just lead to total exhaustion and disillusionment.
Plus, that story about the French chef Bernard Loiseau, who killed himself supposedly over fear of losing a Michelin star. Thiel uses it to illustrate the destructive nature of status competition. But for a creative, hearing that kind of story framed as a business lesson, it could be deeply chilling. It paints this grim picture where market validation becomes everything, potentially silencing creative expression.
It creates a real conflict, doesn't it? How do you take the useful parts, the call for agency, vision, differentiation, without adopting the potentially toxic aspects of hyper-competition and the relentless drive for monopoly that might not fit the creative sphere at all? Success might look very different for them.
Okay, moving on to what they missed. Thiel criticizes this vague, indefinite optimism he sees in society. But you could argue his own vision of definite optimism in startups, while demanding huge effort, borders on a kind of hyper-optimism itself, right? Like an almost naive faith in our ability to perfectly design and control the future through sheer will and intellect.
That's a really interesting blind spot to point out. There's an element of downplaying contingency, luck, external factors, the sheer messiness of reality. And tied to that, the book's perspective is intensely focused on a very specific world. High-tech, VC-backed Silicon Valley startups.
Right. It doesn't spend much time exploring how these principles translate or don't translate to other industries. What about a biotech company with much longer development cycles? Or a social enterprise? Or a business in a completely different cultural context, say Japan or Germany, where business norms and risk appetite are different?
Exactly. The applicability outside that SV bubble isn't deeply explored. Even his examples of founder traits like needing to be an outsider, maybe even a bit of a rule breaker, like Sean Parker the hacker, feel very much like Silicon Valley archetypes.
Right.
Is that a universal requirement for founding any kind of successful company globally? Maybe not.
And while he does a great job using the failed clean tech companies to illustrate what happens when you ignore his 7 questions.
Like Solindra's bad tech or Better Place's flawed distribution model.
Right. But he doesn't really delve into counterexamples. What about successful companies that maybe didn't achieve a true monopoly? Or companies that did use a more lean, iterative approach early on and still succeeded massively? The book presents a very stark binary choice: creative monopoly or failure.
Yeah, it overlooks that vast middle ground of successful, sustainable businesses that might be leaders in a niche or highly profitable in a competitive market through execution and differentiation, but aren't monopolies in the Thielian sense. The focus is almost exclusively on the extreme outliers, the Facebooks and Googles.
Which makes for compelling stories, but maybe not a universally applicable map.
It's a specific map for a specific kind of treasure hunt.
Now, what about ideas in the book that feel familiar? Ideas that maybe Thiel repackages or rebrands effectively, but aren't entirely novel. Let's start with the concept of the secret. Finding that hidden truth about nature or people that unlocks a huge business opportunity.
It's a powerful metaphor, the secret. He frames it almost like joining a conspiracy to change the world. But the core idea that competitive advantage often comes from knowing something or seeing something that others don't, that's pretty fundamental to business strategy and investment theory.
Like informational asymmetry or finding a blue ocean market.
Exactly. Concepts like looking for unmet needs, underserved markets, non-obvious opportunities, these have been around. Thiel gives it this almost mystical quality, this emphasis on secrets hiding in plain sight. But his core point that big opportunities often lie in overlooked truths is a restatement of a classic entrepreneurial insight. He just frames it in a very compelling, contrarian way.
Okay, what about the mafia? The PayPal mafia is legendary. This tight-knit group that went on to found or fund LinkedIn, YouTube, Tesla, SpaceX, Yelp.
An incredible network, undeniably. Thiel uses it as the prime example of building this intensely loyal, mission-driven team where the bonds last long after the initial venture. But again, while the PayPal mafia is perhaps an extreme example, the underlying power of strong professional networks and alumni communities isn't unique to them or to tech startups.
Think about networks from old consulting firms, investment banks, research labs.
Right. Places like Bell Labs, Xerox Sociers, McKinsey, Goldman Sachs, they've all spawned influential networks. Strong communities built on shared experience and trust are a powerful force in any fields. Thiel highlights the intensity and shared mission aspect, which might be particularly strong in startups, but the fundamental concept of network effects driving future success is broader than just his experience.
And lastly, the power law. The idea that outcomes are drastically unequal. A few things account for most of the results, like one investment in a VC fund returning more than all the others combined.
The Pareto principle, the 80-20 rule on steroids. It's a well-documented statistical phenomenon. You see it in wealth distribution, city sizes, word frequency, earthquake magnitudes. It pops up everywhere.
But Peele takes this observation and turns it into a strict prescription for strategy, right? Especially for VCs. Only invest in companies that have the potential to return the value of the entire fund.
Exactly. He moves from describing a statistical pattern to mandating a very specific, highly concentrated investment strategy based on it. While the power law describes VC returns pretty well, Thiel's insistence that this must be the only rule, the sole focus, is his interpretation and strategic choice. It's not an inherent, universally accepted law of how all investing, or even all venture investing, must be done. He's using a valid observation to justify a very specific, high-risk, high-reward philosophy.
It's taking a descriptive law and making it a prescriptive command.
Pretty much. Don't diversify your bets, put all your chips on the one potential grand slam.
All right, let's dive into our mini-debate. This one's a classic Thielism, and it comes from Chapter 13, talking about why so many clean tech companies failed back in the day. He says a big clue was that they were run by shockingly non-technical teams. And the most obvious sign, he says it was sartorial. Clean tech executives were running around wearing suits and ties. Then he drops the punchline. Never invest in a tech CEO that wears a suit.
Oh yeah, the infamous suit test.
It just feels like peak Silicon Valley stereotype, doesn't it? Like your clothes determine your competence. How superficial can you get in a book about deep first principles thinking? It seems so arbitrary.
I get why it sounds that way. On the surface, judging someone by their clothes is obviously simplistic, but I think for Thiel, it's not really about the fabric or the tie knot. It's about what the suit signified in that specific context. Silicon Valley, Post.com, in the clean tech bubble.
Okay, what did it signify to him?
It signified conformity. It signaled adherence to conventional wisdom, especially the wisdom of traditional business and government circles, which is exactly where clean tech was often looking for funding and validation. A suit, in that world, was the expected uniform if you were trying to look like a serious executive, especially if you were pitching politicians or East Coast financiers.
So as a sign they weren't true tech outsiders. They were playing the established game.
That seems to be his read. It suggested a focus on external appearances, on salesmanship in the traditional sense, being good at raising capital and securing government subsidies, as he puts it, rather than being deeply focused on building truly revolutionary technology. He saw it as a proxy for a lack of authenticity to the core tech mission, a sign they were maybe more salesman than engineer at heart. Think about the contrast with someone like Musk, who he praises is definitely not known for power suits.
But hold on. Isn't a CEO supposed to be a good salesperson? Thiel himself hammers that point home. Sales matters just as much as product. He even says all salesmen are actors and talks about how the best sales is hidden. Couldn't the suit just be part of the necessary performance? Especially for clean tech, which needed that government support and public trust, maybe wearing a suit was just smart, hidden sales for that specific audience.
That's a really sharp point, and it highlights the paradox, doesn't it? Yes, sales is crucial, but Thiel seems to differentiate between effective hidden sales, convincing people based on substance and a unique vision, and obvious salesmanship, relying on conventional signals like a suit. If you look like the stereotypical salesman, the kind he thinks is bad at it, maybe you lack the substance. His underlying point seems to be, if your tech is truly groundbreaking, 10x better, and your team is genuinely mission-driven, you shouldn't need to rely on traditional status symbols like a suit to be convincing. Your unique value should speak for itself, even as you cleverly sell it.
So the suit becomes a potential indicator that the underlying tech isn't strong enough, or that the founder is more focused on conforming to external expectations than building something radically new.
I think that's the implication. It's a heuristic, a shortcut he used. It flagged founders who might be playing the social entrepreneurship game, looking good, saying the right things, fitting in, rather than being laser-focused on solving a hard technical problem to build a real creative monopoly. It was a quick filter for spotting conformity in a world where he believed radical nonconformity was essential.
Okay, I see the logic behind it now, even if it still feels a bit tribal. Like judging people based on whether they adhere to the Silicon Valley dress code or lack thereof. But I guess for Thiel, that code or breaking it signifies something deeper about mindset.
Exactly. It's a provocative shortcut, rooted in his specific observations during that clean tech bubble, a red flag for potential misalignment with the 0 to 1 ethos.
All right, let's get to our hot take. What's really going on with this book, 0 to 1? It started as notes for a Stanford class, right? Thiel frames it as an exercise in thinking, not a rigid formula. Yet, it feels pretty prescriptive sometimes.
It does, and it consistently circles back to the success of Founders Fund, his venture firm, and emphasizes that power law dynamic, how a tiny number of investments, like their Facebook investment, drive almost all the returns.
So, is this whole book basically a giant, incredibly sophisticated marketing funnel for Founders Fund?
You could definitely make that argument. It's like he's laying out this very specific contrarian philosophy of how to build truly valuable companies. And in doing so, he's attracting exactly the kind of founders who resonate with that philosophy, the ambitious, unconventional, maybe slightly antisocial 0-1 thinkers.
The ones who want to build monopolies.
Right. By defining the game this way, he essentially filters the entrepreneurial pool and draws the players he most wants to back towards his firm. It creates this self-reinforcing loop. It's clearly not just generic ghost-written fluff. The voice and ideas are distinctively Thiel's, but does it also serve as a powerful tool to enhance his deal flow and reinforce his influence? Almost certainly.
It's like he's teaching the class, but also recruiting the star students.
That's a good way to put it.
Okay, another angle. How much of 0 to 1 is less universal business wisdom and more startup trauma, specifically Thiel's trauma from the PayPal days and the dot-com crash? He admits he was scared out of his wits back then.
That's a really powerful lens to view it through. The whole structure, especially the 4 dogmas he rails against, feels like a direct, almost visceral reaction to the excesses and failures he witnessed and survived in 1999 and 2000.
Like the fear of grand visions, the obsession with lean flexibility, focusing only on tiny improvements, thinking sale doesn't matter. Those are all reversals of bubble-era thinking.
Exactly. He's arguing for the opposite principles. But the entire framework is shaped by that traumatic period. The intense emphasis on ruthlessness, competition pushes people toward ruthlessness or death, or that almost tragic Shakespearean view of competition where rivals just become obsessed with destroying each other. Does that sound like universal economic truth, or does it sound like someone's scarred by the brutal PayPal versus X.com wars?
Yeah, he talks about working 100-hour weeks, an engineer designing a bomb. That's not normal business competition. That sounds like existential trench warfare.
No.
Could the whole monopoly is good argument be at least partly a rationalization born from surviving that kind of brutal zero-sum fight? Like, the only way to escape that hell is to achieve total dominance.
It's very plausible. Surviving that kind of intense, high-stakes conflict could absolutely forge a worldview where escaping competition isn't just a strategy, it's a psychological necessity. It doesn't invalidate the insights. Many are incredibly sharp, but understanding that potential origin and trauma adds a really important layer of context to the book's sometimes absolute claims. It explains the intensity, perhaps.
Okay, let's zoom out for our final meta take. What does 0 to 1 say about our current moment, and what might its long-term legacy be? Beyond the specific startup advice, it feels like a broader philosophical statement.
I think it is. Thiel's core argument is that the Western world, maybe since the 70s or 80s, has fallen into this state of indefinite optimism. We sort of vaguely expect things to get better, progress to happen automatically, but we lack concrete, ambitious plans for the future.
We've lost the appetite for grand projects, big visions.
That's his diagnosis. He sees it in finance, diversification over directed investment, in politics, process over bold solutions, in philosophy, critique over constructing new visions. It's a lament for a perceived loss of agency and ambition.
And the book is essentially his call to action against that drift. It's urging individuals, companies, maybe even society, to reject randomness, the unjust tyranny of chance, as he dramatically puts it, and embrace definite mastery, to actively design and build the future, not just react to it.
Yeah, it's a demanding call for intentionality, a return to that spirit of, say, the Apollo program or major infrastructure projects where people had specific, audacious goals and mobilized to achieve them.
So how will it age? Is it a timeless manifesto for innovators or more of a time capsule from a specific Silicon Valley era?
That's the million-dollar question. Its core challenge to complacency, to conventional thinking about competition and incrementalism that feels pretty timeless. It will likely continue to inspire founders who want to break molds. But some of the more absolute positions, monopoly is always the goal. The suit test is a reliable indicator. The intense focus solely on VC-backed tech, those might feel more dated or overly dogmatic over time. Markets evolve, societal values shift, new models emerge.
So its enduring legacy might be less about the specific prescriptions and more about that fundamental reframe, shifting the view of entrepreneurial success from luck or circumstance to a deliberate act of creation.
I think so. It's that demand for intentionality, for having a definite vision in an increasingly uncertain world. It stands in such stark contrast to the easier paths of iteration or adaptation. It creates this productive pressure, challenging us to think bigger, to take agency. Even if we don't buy into every single one of Thiel's arguments, it forces you to ask, what future am I trying to build?
Okay, let's wrap up with our final thoughts. First, a what if prompt to leave you with. What if the most important secret, the kind Thiel talks about, isn't actually hidden out there in nature or society, but it's a secret about ourselves, about our own innate capacity for that 0 to 1 creation, a capacity we've maybe been conditioned to ignore by a world that rewards copying and competing more than inventing.
Ooh, I like that. And for a quirky-related recommendation, if you want a tangible glimpse into an era of ambitious, definite optimism, check out the Bay Model in Sausalito, just north of San Francisco.
The Bay Model, what is it?
It's this huge, like 1.5-acre, working hydraulic scale model of the entire San Francisco Bay and Delta system. The Army Corps of Engineers built it back in the 1950s, and one reason they built it was to test these incredibly grand, maybe crazy engineering plans, like the Rubber plan to build giant dams across the bay and turn huge parts of it into freshwater lakes.
Wow. They actually modeled that.
They did. It's this amazing physical relic from a time when people really did embrace big plans and weren't afraid to think about radically reshaping the world. A perfect symbol of definite optimism, maybe?
That sounds fascinating. We'll put a link somewhere. Okay, now it's your turn. What's your hot take on 0 to 1? Does Thiel's case for monopoly convince you or does it worry you? How do you think about definite plans versus flexibility in your own work or life? Let us know in the comments below.
Yeah, we'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you got value from this deep dive, if you enjoy challenging conventional wisdom with us, please do like this video, subscribe to the deep dive, and help us keep escaping the echo chamber.
Thanks for joining us. See you next time.